They called it inadequate. The Browning automatic rifle, weighing barely 20 pounds, facing the unstoppable MG-42, Hitler's buzzsaw that could spit 1,200 rounds per minute. German machine gunners mockingly called the American weapon a relic, a toy from the Great War brought to a modern battlefield. Yet in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, when the Reich unleashed its final desperate gamble, these so-called relics would carve their names into legend. What transformed a weapon dismissed as obsolete into the instrument that broke the spine of Germany's last offensive? The answer lies not in the specifications, but in the hands that wielded it and the doctrine that unleashed its fury. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Ardennes Forest, December 1944. Snow fell in heavy curtains, muffling the world beneath a blanket of white silence. Through the dense pine trees, where visibility shrank to mere yards, the cold bit through every layer of clothing, turning fingers numb and breath into clouds of frozen mist. American infantry huddled in foxholes carved from the frozen earth, their positions stretched thin along a front that command had deemed quiet, a place for green troops to gain experience and battered veterans to recover from months of grinding combat. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh from America and barely blooded, held the line alongside exhausted remnants of units that had fought since Normandy. They believed the war had moved elsewhere, that the Germans were finished, broken by months of retreat. They were catastrophically wrong. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 16, the forest erupted. Artillery shells screamed from the sky, tearing through the canopy and exploding among the American positions with devastating fury. The barrage was unlike anything the veterans had experienced, a thunderous symphony of destruction that went on, pulverizing defensive lines and severing communication between scattered units. When the guns finally fell silent, a different sound emerged from the east, the grinding rumble of tank treads and the tramp of thousands of boots crunching through snow. Operation Walk am Rhein had begun. Hitler's last great offensive in the west, a desperate thrust aimed at splitting the Allied armies and capturing the vital port of Antwerp, rolled forward with over 200,000 men and hundreds of tanks. The Führer had staked everything on this gamble, stripping the Eastern Front to assemble the force, gambling that a decisive blow might force the Western Allies to negotiate and allow him to turn all his strength against the Soviets. Leading the assault came the elite formations, SS Panzer divisions and veteran Wehrmacht units that had survived years of brutal warfare. With them came weapons that had earned fearsome reputations on battlefields from Stalingrad to Cannes. Chief among these was the MG-42, the Maskeningewehre 42, a machine gun so lethal that Allied soldiers had given it a nickname born of pure terror. They called it Hitler's buzzsaw for the distinctive ripping sound it made when firing, a sound that froze men in their tracks and sent them scrambling for any cover they could find. The MG-42 could fire up to 1,200 rounds per minute, more than twice the rate of the American .30 caliber Browning machine gun. Its sustained fire capability was extraordinary. The barrel could be changed in seconds, allowing crews to pour out devastating volumes of lead without pause. German doctrine built entire defensive and offensive tactics around this weapon, using it to create kill zones that no infantry could cross. Machine gun teams were the backbone of every German formation, trained to establish interlocking fields of fire that turned open ground into a graveyard. The crews manning these weapons were professionals, many of them veterans of the Russian front where they had learned their deadly craft in the most unforgiving school of war imaginable. They knew their weapon intimately, understood its capabilities and limitations, and had absolute confidence in its superiority over anything the Americans could field. When they looked at the American infantry weapon, the Browning automatic rifle, they saw nothing to concern them. The bar was a relic in their eyes, a design dating back to 1918, heavy and awkward, capable of only 500 rounds per minute at best. It fed from a 20-round magazine that had to be changed constantly, breaking the continuity of fire. To the German machine gunners, it was not even a true machine gun, merely an oversized rifle that one man could carry. They had faced it before in France and Belgium, and while they respected American artillery and air power, the infantry's primary automatic weapon struck them as hopelessly inadequate for modern warfare. What the Germans failed to understand was that the bar was never meant to compete with their machine guns and sustain fire. The American tactical philosophy differed fundamentally from the German approach. Where German infantry tactics centered on the machine gun with riflemen supporting it, American doctrine emphasized the rifle squad as the basic unit of maneuver, with every element contributing to overwhelming firepower at the point of contact. The bar was designed as a squad automatic weapon, providing mobile fire support that could move with the riflemen, suppressing enemy positions while the squad maneuvered. It fired the powerful 30-06 Springfield cartridge, the same round used in the M1 Garand rifle, a cartridge with excellent range and stopping power. The weapon was accurate, reliable in the worst conditions, and in the hands of a trained operator, could deliver precise, devastating bursts that could shred through wooden positions, tear apart sandbag emplacements, and cut down exposed infantry with ruthless efficiency. The men selected to carry the bar in each squad were chosen carefully. The weapon weighed 19 pounds unloaded, significantly heavier than the standard M1 Garand rifle's 9.5 pounds. Carrying it through mud, snow, and across miles of terrain required physical strength and endurance. But more than that, it required a particular temperament. The barman knew he was a primary target. German soldiers were trained to identify and eliminate automatic weapons first, understanding that suppressing or destroying them opened gaps in American fire. Every bar gunner understood that when contact was made, enemy fire would seek him out. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, the men who carried the Browning often developed a fierce attachment to their weapons, a bond forged in combat and sustained by the knowledge that their firepower could mean the difference between their squad's survival and annihilation. Among the units scattered through the Ardennes forests were men who would soon prove that training, courage, and tactical flexibility could transform even an underestimated weapon into an instrument of devastating effect. These were riflemen from the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, holding positions around the Elsenborn Ridge and the towns of Krinkel-Trotscherath. They were combat engineers from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, positioned near Malmedy. They were paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, rushed to the collapsing front at Bastogne and Saint-Vith. Many were cold, tired, low on ammunition, and facing an enemy that outnumbered them significantly. But they had been trained in a doctrine that emphasized aggressive fire and maneuver, and they carried weapons that, when properly employed, could deliver shocking violence at close range. The German offensive initially achieved stunning success. Entire American units were overrun or surrounded in the first hours. Communication broke down as headquarters tried desperately to understand the scale of the attack. Panic spread through some sectors as Green troops, facing combat for the first time under the worst possible circumstances, broke and fled. Roads became clogged with retreating vehicles, supply trucks, and shell-shocked soldiers. Yet even in the chaos, pockets of resistance formed. Small groups of infantry, often led by junior officers or even sergeants, made stands in villages, at crossroads, in the forests themselves. These delaying actions, bought with blood, slowed the German advance at critical moments, disrupting timetables that the offensive depended upon. Hitler's plan required rapid movement to reach the Meuse River before Allied reserves could respond. Every hour of delay mattered. Every road junction held against the tide gave Eisenhower time to shift forces and seal the breach. In the northern shoulder of the German penetration, around the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath, elements of the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions found themselves directly in the path of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. This elite formation, despite its youth, the division had been raised from Hitler Youth Volunteers in 1943, was a veteran unit that had fought with fanatical determination in Normandy. Now it was tasked with smashing through the American line and driving west. The villages of Krinkel-Trotscherath sat astride a crucial road network. If the Germans could take them quickly, the route to the Elsenborn.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Ridge and beyond would lie open. The American defenders, however, had no intention of yielding without a fight. The fighting that erupted in these villages became some of the most intense close-quarters combat of the entire Battle of the Bulge. German tanks, Panthers and Panzer IVs, rumbled down the narrow streets, their engines echoing between stone buildings. SS Panzergrenadiers followed, moving in squad-sized elements, coordinating with the armor to clear buildings methodically. They expected to overwhelm the Americans through shock and firepower, to drive them out through sheer violence. Instead, they ran into a buzzsaw of a different kind. American infantry, positioned in buildings, basements, and rubble piles, opened fire at murderously close range. Bazooka's team stalked the tanks through the ruins, firing from upper windows and disappearing before return fire could find them. Rifle squads engaged the German infantry in brutal room-to-room fighting where battles were decided in seconds and measured in yards. It was here, in the chaos of urban combat where visibility was measured in building lengths and engagements happened at ranges where men could see each other's faces, that the true value of the bar became devastatingly clear. German MG-42 teams attempted to set up their weapons in windows and doorways to provide covering fire for their advancing infantry, but the positions that offered good fields of fire also exposed them to American counterfire. The bar gunners, working in coordination with their squad's riflemen, would identify these positions and pour concentrated fire into them. The heavy 30-06 rounds punched through wooden window frames, shattered masonry, and tore through the sandbags that German crews sheltered behind. Unlike the sustained fire of the MG-42, which required regular barrel changes and created a predictable rhythm, the bar's bursts were shorter, sharper, harder to predict. A skilled gunner could fire a precise 5 to 10 round burst, shift position while his assistant fed a fresh magazine, and fire again from a different angle before the enemy could adjust. Private First Class Robert Harmon of Company E, 23rd Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division, found himself positioned on the second floor of a stone house in Rocherath on the morning of December 17. His squad had been ordered to hold the building to cover the withdrawal of other elements falling back toward Elsenborn. German infantry was advancing down the street in coordination with a Panther tank that was methodically demolishing defensive positions with its main gun. Harmon's squad leader, Sergeant William Casper, positioned the men at windows overlooking the street, telling them to hold fire until the Germans were fully committed. The tension mounted as the sound of German voices grew louder, harsh commands barked in a language most of the Americans didn't understand but whose meaning was clear. Then the first German soldiers appeared, moving quickly between buildings, their weapons ready, confident in their advance. Casper gave the signal. The entire squad opened fire simultaneously, M1 Garand's cracking in rapid semi-automatic fire, and Harmon's bar roaring to life with a deeper, heavier bark. The German infantry were caught in the open, the lead elements cut down instantly, others diving for cover behind rubble or pressing themselves against building walls. Harmon fired in controlled bursts, his weapon bucking against his shoulder, the smell of burnt powder filling his nostrils. He saw his rounds impacting, saw German soldiers falling, saw others scrambling backward. Then he spotted it, an MG-42 team setting up in a doorway across the street, the gunner frantically trying to get his weapon into action while the assistant fed the belt. Harmon shifted his aim and squeezed the trigger. His first burst went high, chipping stone above the doorway. He adjusted, fired again, and this time his rounds found their mark. The heavy bullets tore through the wooden doorframe and into the German position. The assistant gunner crumpled, the weapon clattering to the ground. The gunner himself tried to retrieve the MG-42, but another burst from Harmon's bar caught him across the chest, and he went down. The engagement lasted perhaps 2 minutes before the Germans pulled back, leaving their dead in the street and carrying their wounded. Harmon's assistant, Private James Coltrane, quickly swapped out his empty magazine for a fresh one while Harmon scanned for new targets. His hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline, but his breathing was controlled, deliberate. Casper moved along the line of windows, checking his men, offering terse words of approval. He knew this was just the beginning, that the Germans would return with more force, likely with artillery or the tank's main gun aimed directly at their position. But for now, they had held. The bar had proven its worth in the close-quarters chaos where there was no time for sustained fire, where precision and mobility mattered more than sheer volume. Similar scenes played out across both villages as the battle intensified throughout December 17th and 18th. German forces, frustrated by the stubborn American resistance, committed more troops and armor, determined to break through. American commanders fed reinforcements into the battle, understanding that every hour these villages were held gave the defensive line at Elsenborn time to solidify. The fighting became a savage, grinding affair. Buildings changed hands multiple times. Dead from both sides littered the streets. Ammunition ran low, forcing American soldiers to scavenge from the fallen. Medical aid stations overflowed with wounded. Yet the line held. In the southern sector of the German offensive, near the town of Bastogne, an even more critical drama was unfolding. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division, raced to reach the town before German forces could encircle it. Bastogne sat at the center of a crucial road network. 7 major roads converged there, making it vital for any German advance westward. If the Germans could take Bastogne quickly, their armor could flow through and exploit the breakthrough. If the Americans could hold it, the German advance would be channeled and slowed, buying time for Patton's Third Army to counterattack from the south. The paratroopers of the 101st reached Bastogne on December 19, just hours before German forces began to surround the town. What followed was one of the most famous sieges in American military history, but in the early days, before the siege became total, the fighting around Bastogne's perimeter was fluid and desperate. Staff Sergeant Michael Braddock of Company C, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, found himself dug in along a tree line east of Bastogne on the night of December 19. His squad, like most in the division, had been pulled from rest areas in France and trucked north through the chaos of the retreating front. They had arrived with whatever equipment they carried, many men lacking proper winter clothing, ammunition stocks incomplete, heavy weapons scattered among various companies. Braddock's squad had one bar, carried by Private Anthony Rizzo, a stocky kid from Philadelphia who had carried the weapons since Normandy. Rizzo treated his bar like a personal treasure, cleaning it obsessively, knowing that in combat it might be all that stood between his squad and being overrun. The Germans probed the American positions throughout the night, trying to identify weak points before launching a major assault. Braddock's squad could hear them moving in the darkness, voices calling to each other, the clink of equipment, the snap of branches. Flares occasionally lit the sky, casting everything in stark shadows before plunging back to darkness. Then at dawn on December 20th, the assault came. German infantry emerged from the tree line 200 yards away, advancing in skirmish lines with machine gun teams providing covering fire from positions further back. The distinctive sound of MG-42s ripping through the morning air signaled the start of the attack. Braddock and his men opened fire, but the German machine guns had them pinned, rounds snapping overhead, forcing them to keep their heads down. Rizzo, however, had positioned himself slightly to the flank, behind a fallen log that provided decent cover and a good field of fire. When the German infantry reached the halfway point, bunching up slightly as they navigated through scattered trees, he opened up. The bar's heavy rounds cut through the German line at chest height, the weapon's muzzle climbing slightly with each burst despite Rizzo's best efforts to control it. He fired, adjusted, fired again, working the trigger in short controlled pulls. German soldiers went down, others dove for cover, the momentum of their advance broken. Rizzo's assistant, Private Eugene Walsh, kept feeding him magazines as fast as he could empty them, the two working with the synchronization born of months fighting together. The German machine gunners tried to locate and suppress Rizzo's position, but he was firing from behind good cover and shifting slightly. After each burst, their rounds tore through the log and kicked up dirt around him, but he kept firing. The German assault wavered, then broke, soldiers pulling back to their starting positions. Braddock immediately ordered his squad to shift positions, knowing the Germans would bring artillery or mortar fire down on their location. They moved 50 yards north along the tree line, digging hasty fighting positions in the frozen ground with entrenching tools, working frantically against time. The artillery came 10 minutes later, shells crashing into their previous positions, shredding trees, and throwing up fountains of frozen earth. Braddock's squad huddled in their new holes, the concussions from nearby impacts pressing against their chests, ears ringing from the barrage. When it lifted, the Germans came again, this time with armor support, a single Panzer IV tank leading the infantry forward. The paratroopers called for bazooka teams, but the tank was hanging back, using its machine guns to rake the American positions while the infantry advanced. It was Rizzo again who made the difference. As the German infantry closed to within 100 yards, he rose from his position and fired burst after burst into their ranks, forcing them to ground. The tank's machine gun swung toward him, tracers walking across the frozen field, but before they could find him, a bazooka team from a neighboring squad managed to get a shot off, the rocket striking the Panzer IV's track and immobilizing it. The German infantry, without their armored support and taking casualties from concentrated American fire, pulled back again. This pattern repeated across the entire perimeter of Bastogne in those early days. German forces would probe, assault, try to find a weak point they could exploit to break into the town. American paratroopers, tankers, and attached infantry units would hold them off through sheer determination and aggressive firepower. The bar gunners in particular earned the respect of their comrades during these desperate hours. They were often the difference between a position holding or being overrun, their mobile firepower allowing squads to shift and respond to threats faster than if they had relied on heavier, tripod-mounted weapons. By December 22, Bastogne was completely surrounded. German forces controlled all the roads leading in and out, cutting the garrison off from supply and reinforcement. The siege had begun in earnest. Inside the pocket, ammunition, food, and medical supplies ran dangerously low. The weather turned worse, snow and fog preventing air resupply. German artillery pounded the town methodically, and periodic assaults tested the defenses. On December 22, German emissaries approached under a flag of truce, delivering an ultimatum demanding surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's famous one-word response, "Nuts," embodied the defiant spirit of the defenders, but words alone wouldn't hold the line. That job fell to the soldiers in the frozen foxholes, and increasingly, to the bar gunners whose weapons provided the backbone of the defensive fire. Technical Sergeant Paul Henderson of Company A, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, commanded a squad holding a section of the southwestern perimeter near the village of Marvy. His position anchored the flank of the defensive line, and German commanders recognized it as a potential weak point. On the afternoon of December 23, the weather cleared enough for American transport planes to begin dropping desperately needed supplies, but it also allowed German forces to launch a coordinated assault against Marvy. Infantry from the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, elite German paratroopers, attacked in company strength, supported by assault guns and machine gun fire. Henderson's squad was undermanned, down to 7 effectives after casualties in previous engagements, but they had 2 bars, one carried by Corporal David Lynch and the other by Private First Class Raymond Torres. Henderson positioned them 20 yards apart to create overlapping fields of fire covering the approach to their section of line. When the German assault came, it came hard, infantry rushing forward in short bounds while machine guns hammered the American positions. Henderson and his riflemen fired steadily, trying to slow the advance, but the sheer weight of German fire was overwhelming. Several men were hit, forced to the bottom of their foxholes, unable to return fire effectively. Lynch and Torres, however, kept their bars in action. They fired in turn, one shooting while the other changed magazines, maintaining a near-constant stream of fire that ripped into the advancing Germans. The attackers were forced to ground repeatedly, unable to gain momentum. Lynch spotted a German machine gun team trying to set up behind a low stone wall 50 yards away. He shifted his fire, putting burst after burst into the position. Stone chips flew, rounds punched through the wall, and the German crew abandoned the position, leaving their weapon behind. Torres engaged German infantry attempting to flank from the right, his fire cutting through their formation and forcing them back toward the center where they bunched up, making themselves better targets for the American riflemen. The assault lasted nearly an hour, waves of German infantry trying to break through, each wave met with determined fire. American artillery, responding to frantic calls from forward observers, added its weight to the defense, shells exploding among the German formations. But it was the direct fire from the defending infantrymen, particularly the sustained pressure from the bars, that ultimately broke the attack. The Germans pulled back, leaving their dead scattered across the snowy field. Henderson's squad had held, though at a cost. 2 men were dead, 3 more wounded badly enough to need evacuation to the aid station. Lynch's bar had a cracked stock from a near miss, but it still functioned. Torres was uninjured but nearly deaf from firing without proper hearing protection, his ears ringing so badly he could barely hear Henderson's shouted orders. As December wore on, the pattern continued. German forces hammered at Bastogne from all sides, trying to crack the defense before Patton's relieving force could arrive from the south. Inside the pocket, casualties mounted, supplies dwindled, and exhaustion wore at every man. Yet the line held. The paratroopers and attached units had transformed the town and its surrounding villages into a fortress, every building a strong point, every road a kill zone. When German forces finally committed their armor in a major push on Christmas Day, attempting to smash through from the northwest near Champs, they ran into the same combination of determined infantry, well-sighted anti-tank weapons, and aggressive automatic weapons fire that had stopped every previous assault. Meanwhile, in the northern shoulder of the Bulge, the fighting around Elsenborn Ridge had reached a crescendo. The 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, battered but intact after their fighting withdrawal from Krinkel-Trocherath, had established a solid defensive line along the ridge itself. German forces, particularly the 12th SS Panzer Division, needed to break through this position to exploit their penetration, but the Americans had turned Elsenborn into a formidable defensive position. Artillery was registered on every approach, interlocking fields of fire covered all avenues, and the infantry was dug in deep. When the Germans launched their attacks, they walked into a killing ground. First Lieutenant Thomas Garrett commanded a platoon from Company F, 38th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division, holding a section of the line directly facing the main German axis of advance. His platoon's position covered a narrow valley that the Germans had to cross to reach the ridge. Garrett had positioned his 3 squads to create a deadly crossfire, with particular attention paid to placing his bar gunners where they could deliver maximum effect. When the German assault came on December 20th, preceded by a heavy artillery barrage, Garrett's platoon was ready. The German infantry advanced in textbook fashion, using terrain for cover, moving in bounds while machine guns provided suppression. They were professionals, veterans who knew their business. But Garrett's men were veterans too, survivors of months of combat who had learned their own lessons. As the Germans entered the valley, Garrett held fire, letting them commit fully. Then, at a range of less than 200 yards, he gave the order. The entire platoon opened up simultaneously, creating a storm of fire that caught the Germans in the open. The bar gunners in particular wreaked havoc, their sustained fire cutting through the German formations like a scythe through wheat. Private First Class Kenneth Morrison, one of Garrett's bar gunners, had positioned himself behind a fallen tree with excellent fields of fire down the valley. He fired methodically, burst after burst, working across the German line from left to right. His assistant, Private Harold Stevens, kept him supplied with magazines, and when Morrison's barrel began to glow from the heat of sustained firing, Stevens used snow packed around the barrel jacket to cool it enough to continue. Morrison could see his rounds hitting, see German soldiers going down, see others diving for whatever cover they could find. An MG-42 team tried to set up to return fire, but Morrison shifted his aim and put 2 bursts into their position before they could get their weapon into action. The German assault broke under the weight of American fire, survivors pulling back across the valley floor, leaving dozens of dead and wounded behind. Garrett's platoon had held without losing a single man, though several positions had been hit by German return fire and everyone was shaken by the intensity of the exchange. Morrison's hands trembled as he reloaded, not from fear but from the physical exertion of controlling the weapon during extended firing. His shoulder ached from the bar's recoil, and his ears rang despite the cold helping to dull some of the noise. But his weapon had performed flawlessly, and his squad had survived. That was all that mattered. The German high command watched their offensive grind to a halt with growing desperation. By the day after Christmas, it had become clear that Bastogne would not fall easily, that the northern shoulder around Elsenborn remained an impenetrable barrier, and that American reinforcements were flooding into the battle faster than intelligence had predicted. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, understood that time was slipping away. The weather had cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to dominate the skies, striking German columns and supply lines with devastating effect. Fuel shortages plagued the panzer divisions, many tanks sitting immobile for lack of gasoline while Allied fighter bombers hunted them relentlessly. Yet Hitler refused to consider withdrawal, insisting that the offensive continue, that one more push would break the Americans and salvage the campaign. On December 26, elements of Patton's Third Army finally broke through to Bastogne from the south, ending the siege and allowing supplies and reinforcements to flow into the battered garrison. The paratroopers who had held the town through a week of bombardment and assault emerged from their positions gaunt, exhausted, but victorious. The stand at Bastogne became instant legend, a symbol of American determination, but the battle for the Bulge was far from over. German forces still held a massive salient driven deep into Allied lines, and reducing it would require weeks of brutal winter combat. In the village of Chinon, southwest of Bastogne, Staff Sergeant Vincent Calabrese of Company G, 87th Infantry Division, prepared his squad for the counteroffensive. The 87th had been rushed north from the 3rd Army sector and thrown into the line to help reduce the German bulge. Calabrese was a veteran of the Italian campaign, transferred to fill gaps in infantry units depleted by months of fighting. His squad consisted mostly of replacements, young soldiers with limited combat experience who looked to him for leadership and reassurance he wasn't always sure he could provide. They had one bar, carried by Private Leonard Kozlowski, a farm boy from Wisconsin who had only joined the unit 2 weeks earlier. Kozlowski was eager but green, and Calabrese worried about how he would perform under fire. The sergeant had taken time during their brief preparation to work with the young private, teaching him how to control the weapon's tendency to climb during sustained fire, how to pick his targets and conserve ammunition, how to shift positions after firing to avoid drawing concentrated return fire. Kozlowski absorbed the lessons with quiet intensity, understanding that his performance could mean life or death for the entire squad. When the order came to advance on December 30th, moving to clear German positions around Chinon, Calabrese positioned himself close to Kozlowski, ready to provide guidance if the young bar gunner faltered. The attack began at dawn with an artillery preparation that hammered the German positions for 20 minutes. Then the infantry moved forward across snow-covered fields, squads advancing in staggered lines while tanks from the supporting armor battalion provided covering fire. German resistance was immediate and fierce. Machine gun positions opened up from concealed locations in tree lines and farm buildings, their fire cutting across the advancing Americans. Men went down, others dove for cover behind slight folds in the terrain or into shell craters. Calabrese's squad found themselves pinned down in a shallow depression, German fire snapping overhead, kicking up snow around them. Calabrese spotted the German machine gun that had them pinned, an MG-42 position in the hayloft of a barn 300 yards away. The weapon was perfectly sighted, commanding the entire field they needed to cross. He turned to Kozlowski and pointed out the target, shouting instructions over the noise of battle. The young private nodded, his face pale but determined. He shifted positions slightly to get a better angle, braced the bar against the lip of the depression, and began to fire. His first burst went wide, rounds kicking up splinters from the barn's wall below the hayloft. Calabrese coached him, reminding him to aim high, to compensate for distance. Kozlowski adjusted and fired again. This time his rounds found their mark, punching through the wooden wall of the hayloft. The German machine gun's fire faltered, then stopped. Kozlowski kept firing, putting burst after burst into the position until Calabrese grabbed his shoulder and told him to cease fire, to conserve ammunition. The German position was silent, the threat neutralized. The squad rose and continued their advance, moving quickly before other German positions could react. Kozlowski's hands shook as he reloaded, adrenaline and fear mixing with the exhilaration of having performed successfully under fire. Calabrese clapped him on the shoulder, offering brief words of approval, then pushed the squad forward. The fighting for Chinon lasted 3 days, a grinding house-to-house battle where every building had to be cleared, every cellar and barn checked for German soldiers. The weather remained brutally cold, temperatures dropping well below freezing at night, making even basic survival a challenge. Men suffered from frostbite and exposure as much as from enemy fire. Water froze in canteens, weapons malfunctioned from the cold, and the wounded faced the added danger of freezing to death before they could be evacuated. Through it all, the infantry kept pushing forward, reducing German positions one by one, slowly compressing the salient. Kozlowski proved himself repeatedly during the battle, his initial nervousness giving way to steady competence as he gained experience. On the second day, when a German counterattack nearly overran the company command post, it was Kozlowski's bar that broke up the assault, his fire cutting down the lead German soldiers and forcing the rest to seek cover long enough for American reinforcements to arrive. By the time Chinon was secured, Calabrese had complete confidence in his bar gunner, and the other men in the squad had learned to trust the covering fire that the weapon provided. Further east, near the town of Wiltz, the battle took on a different character. German forces, recognizing that the offensive had failed and that withdrawal was inevitable, fought delaying actions designed to slow the American advance and allow the bulk of their forces to escape the trap. These rearguard battles were often the most vicious, fought by soldiers who knew they were buying time with their lives. The 26th Infantry Division, another of Patton's units thrown into the counteroffensive, found itself in bitter combat against German paratroopers who contested every crossroad and village. Corporal Samuel Wright of Company B, 328th Infantry Regiment, led a fire team that included Private Daniel O'Brien on the bar. Wright was 23 years old but felt decades older, aged by months of combat that had taught him the brutal calculus of infantry warfare. He understood that aggression often meant survival, that hesitation could be fatal, that the side that could bring overwhelming fire to bear at the critical moment usually prevailed. He had trained O'Brien to think the same way, to be aggressive with the bar, to seek targets and engage them immediately rather than waiting for orders. On January 4, Wright's platoon was tasked with clearing a German position that commanded a crossroads south of Wiltz. Intelligence indicated that a reinforced squad of German paratroopers held a cluster of stone buildings, supported by at least one machine gun and possibly a light mortar. The platoon's approach was covered by fog that had rolled in overnight, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. Wright's squad moved carefully through the mist, weapons ready, every sense straining for signs of the enemy. They reached a low stone wall about 75 yards from the German position before they were spotted. The German machine gun opened fire immediately, tracers cutting through the fog, rounds smacking into the stone wall and forcing the Americans to ground. Wright's squad hugged the wall, unable to advance or effectively return fire. The platoon leader called for mortar support, but the fog made accurate fire impossible. Wright realized they would have to neutralize the German position themselves or risk being pinned down until the fog lifted and they became easy targets. He crawled along the wall to where O'Brien had taken cover and outlined a plan. O'Brien would provide covering fire while Wright and 2 riflemen attempted to flank the position from the left. O'Brien positioned the bar in a gap in the stone wall and waited for Wright's signal. When it came, he opened fire, putting burst after burst toward the sound of the German machine gun. He couldn't see his target clearly through the fog, but he didn't need to. His job was to force the German crew to keep their heads down while Wright maneuvered. The bar's heavy rounds slammed into the building where the German position was located, punching through wooden shutters and chipping stone. The MG-42's fire shifted toward O'Brien, rounds cracking past him and hammering the wall, but he kept firing, changing magazines smoothly and continuing to suppress the German position. Wright and his flanking element moved quickly through the fog, using the sound of O'Brien's bar to orient themselves. They reached a position on the German flank and opened fire with rifles and grenades, catching the machine gun crew from an unexpected angle. The German defense collapsed quickly under the simultaneous pressure from 2 directions. When Wright's element stormed the position, they found 3 Germans dead at the machine gun, another 2 wounded, and the rest of the squad retreating through the buildings. O'Brien ceased fire and moved up with the rest of the squad, his bar barrel smoking in the cold air. The crossroads was secured, the platoon's advance could continue. These small unit actions, repeated hundreds of times across the entire salient throughout January, slowly ground down German resistance. American forces attacked from the north, south, and west, squeezing the bulge and pushing German units back toward their starting positions. The weather remained terrible, snow and freezing rain making movement difficult and resupply challenging. Casualties continued to mount on both sides, but the momentum had shifted decisively. By mid-January, German forces were in full retreat, abandoning equipment they couldn't fuel or repair, leaving their wounded behind, desperate to escape the closing trap. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25 when American forces linked up, restoring the original front line. The cost had been staggering. American casualties exceeded 80,000, including 19,000 killed. German losses were even worse, approaching 100,000 casualties and over 800 tanks destroyed. Hitler's last gamble in the West had failed catastrophically, draining the Reich of reserves it could not replace and leaving the road to Germany wide open for the final Allied offensive. In the aftermath, as units rotated to rest areas and replacements filled the gaps left by casualties, soldiers began to assess what they had learned and what had made the difference in the desperate winter battle. Commanders at all levels filed after-action reports analyzing tactics, equipment performance, and lessons for future operations. Among the findings was a notable reevaluation of the Browning automatic rifle. While it had never been dismissed entirely, the bar had often been overshadowed by discussions of heavier weapons, tanks, artillery, and air power. The Bulge demonstrated conclusively that in the close quarters, fluid combat that characterized much of the battle, the squad-level automatic weapon had been absolutely critical. The reports documented countless instances where bar gunners had made the difference between positions holding and being overrun, where their mobile firepower had enabled squads to maneuver under fire, where their accurate bursts had neutralized German machine gun positions that might otherwise have stopped entire platoon advances. The weapon's reliability in extreme cold was particularly noted. While many weapons malfunctioned in the sub-zero temperatures, properly maintained bars continued to function. Their ability to deliver precision fire, compared to the MG-42's less controlled but higher volume output, proved advantageous in the confused close-range battles where identifying targets and avoiding friendly fire casualties was paramount. Technical Sergeant Paul Henderson, who had survived the siege of Bastogne and the subsequent fighting, found himself interviewed by a training and doctrine officer compiling lessons learned. Henderson spoke about the performance of his bar gunners, Lynch and Torres, both of whom had survived the battle though Lynch had been wounded in early January and evacuated. He emphasized the importance of proper training, of selecting men who had the physical strength and mental toughness to handle the weapon, of integrating the bar into squad tactics rather than treating it as a standalone weapon. He noted that the most effective bar gunners were those who worked closely with their assistant gunners and maintained constant communication with their squad leaders, coordinating their fire with the squad's maneuvers. The officer asked Henderson about German reactions to the bar, whether enemy troops had learned to prioritize eliminating the automatic riflemen. Henderson confirmed that Germans definitely targeted bar gunners when they could identify them, but noted that the weapon's mobility made this difficult. Unlike the MG-42, which required time to set up and created a predictable position once firing began, a good bar gunner could fire, move, and fire again from a different spot before the enemy could react effectively. This mobility, Henderson argued, was the weapon's greatest strength in the fluid combat of the Bulge, where static positions were quickly overrun and survival depended on the ability to adapt and relocate rapidly. Similar interviews and reports from across all units involved in the battle painted a consistent picture. The bar, far from being the obsolete weapon that German soldiers had dismissed, had proven to be exactly what American doctrine required, a mobile, reliable automatic weapon that could provide effective fire support at the squad level. It wasn't designed to match the MG-42's sustained fire capability, and it didn't need to. Its role was different, supporting squad maneuvers rather than creating fixed defensive positions, and in that role it had excelled. Private First Class Robert Harmon, who had fought at Rocherath and survived the entire Bulge campaign, reflected on his experiences in a letter to his family written from a rest area in February. He wrote about the friends he had lost, the brutal cold and constant danger, the moments of terror interspersed with long stretches of misery and boredom. But he also wrote about the confidence that came from carrying a weapon he could trust, from knowing that when he squeezed the trigger, the bar would fire and his rounds would go where he aimed them. He described the almost intimate relationship that developed between a soldier and his weapon in combat, how he could field strip and reassemble his bar in complete darkness, how he knew its quirks and characteristics better than any mechanical device he had ever owned. Harman's letter captured something that the official reports, with their emphasis on statistics and tactical analysis, sometimes missed: the human element of warfare, the bond between soldiers and their tools, the way that confidence in one's equipment translated into confidence in oneself and one's unit. The men who had carried bars through the bulge had developed a deep respect for the weapon, and that respect was shared by the comrades who had fought alongside them and witnessed firsthand what the rifles could accomplish. By spring of 1945, as Allied armies drove deep into Germany and the Reich's collapse became inevitable, the tactical lessons of the bulge had been absorbed and disseminated throughout American forces. Training for replacement troops emphasized squad tactics and the integration of the bar into fire and maneuver drills. Units that had performed particularly well during the battle, including many of those that had fought around Bastogne, Elsenborn, and in the reduction of the salient, found their techniques studied and adopted by other formations. The German military, meanwhile, was beyond salvaging. The losses suffered in the bulge, combined with the unrelenting pressure from Soviet forces in the east, had shattered any possibility of meaningful resistance. German soldiers still fought, often with desperate courage, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The MG-42 remained a formidable weapon to the end, feared by Allied soldiers who faced it, but Germany's defeat was determined by factors far beyond individual weapon systems: the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies, the collapse of German logistics and industry, the exhaustion of manpower reserves, and the strategic incompetence of Hitler's leadership. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, the soldiers who had fought through the bulge could look back on their experience with a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in having stopped the German offensive and turned the tide. Grief for the friends who had not survived. Relief that the fighting was finally over. And a quiet recognition that they had been tested in one of the most difficult campaigns of the war and had proven equal to the challenge. The Browning automatic rifle would continue in American service for years after World War II, seeing action in Korea and even into the early years of Vietnam before being replaced by more modern designs. But for the men who had carried it through the frozen forests of the Ardennes, who had used it to hold off German assaults and support their squad's advances, the bar would always hold a special place. It had been their companion through the darkest days of the war, and it had not failed them. In the decades following the war, as historians analyzed the Battle of the Bulge and veterans shared their stories, certain weapons and units achieved iconic status. The Siege of Bastogne became synonymous with American determination. The Elsenborn Ridge defense was recognized as one of the most successful examples of defensive warfare in the campaign. Individual acts of heroism were commemorated with medals and memorials. But the broader story of how American infantry squads, equipped with doctrine and weapons that emphasized flexibility and aggressive fire, had defeated German forces that possessed supposedly superior machine guns and heavier armor, received less attention in popular accounts. The truth was more complex and more interesting than simple narratives of superior or inferior equipment. The Germans had not been wrong about the MG-42's capabilities. It was indeed an exceptional weapon. But they had been wrong to dismiss the bar as inadequate. They had failed to understand that different tactical philosophies required different tools, and that a weapon optimized for mobile squad-level support could be just as effective, sometimes more so, than a weapon designed for sustained defensive fire. The American approach, emphasizing fire and maneuver at the squad level with every soldier contributing to overwhelming firepower at the point of contact, proved remarkably effective in the close quarters, fluid combat that characterized much of the bulge. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.